Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back. I hope you're all doing safe. You're all being safe and everything. I had a request to put Franklin in a video. He's not so keen on being in videos. He's gonna look everywhere except for in the camera. But yeah, he's a very cute dog, and he's doing much better. He's healthier. Had some liver problems for a while. Oh, no, he's hacking a little bit. Okay, so today is I'm gonna do two lectures together. If it runs a little long, the other one ran a lot longer than I expected it to. If this one runs a little long, I actually do need to kind of catch up a little bit where we a little bit behind where I wanted to be. So I'm going to put two lectures together, probably come out to about 90 minutes, I think. But let's just jump into that. So it looks like Franklin already wants out. Want out there? I want to sit in the sun. Okay, he's gonna be okay to sit in the sun a little bit. So, last time we talked about the Constitution. This time I'm gonna get into the Bill of Rights. This is yet another thing that I wanted to be doing with group work, or at least as a piece of a conversation with you guys, but that's not necessarily possible. So anyhow, I left off last time, this debate going back and forth between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. A debate over 2 years of writing letters that are published in newspapers and journals and things like that about should we adopt the Constitution as it is, or do things need to be amended? What are we worried about with that? And a lot of people have argued, if we don't add amendments to the Constitution, then there would be sort of these deep-seated feelings, this distrust for the government would eventually lead to civil war. Like, people were saying that at the time. The civil war got thrown around, quite a bit in these years. People were worried a lot. They were sowing the seeds for where the country would eventually tear itself apart. And sure enough, 80 years later, that those debates were more or less where the country fell apart. It's this issue about states' rights, is a huge part of it. But one thing that they could sort of fix in the meantime was this idea of a Bill of Rights. And James Madison promised if the states voted for the Constitution as it was, he would write up a Bill of Rights. He was largely a Federalist at this time, but decided he's the one who pretty much wrote the Constitution, and like, I will as soon as it gets passed, I'll write up these amendments. All the states had voted on it, except for Rhode Island and North Carolina voted against it. And there's this sort of weird, for a few years, both of those states were basically, for 2 years, were outside of the country technically. They had these sort of strong, the idea of not having enough state power and of being, and citing the lack of Bill of Rights, they would not vote for it. I forgot to move forward here. North Carolina would mainly just act like they were part of the United States. They were passing laws and stuff, assuming that, okay, we're eventually going to join this country. Rhode Island really was acting like they were going to just go their own way. They had no intention of actually joining up with the country. They even had a former Revolutionary War general from Rhode Island took 1,000 men into New Hampshire to break up a celebration. After they voted for the Constitution, this town is having this big celebration for it, and this general shows up with 1,000 men to break up their celebration for the Constitution. It was largely symbolic and peaceful, they weren't shooting people or anything like that, but it was sort of this generally friendly, but they had this idea of like, we are never taking the Constitution. North Carolina would eventually cave after the Bill of Rights was passed. Rhode Island tried to hold out for a long time and said, no, forget it. We're never going to do this. And then the other states said, well, if you're going to act like another country, then we better put tariffs on you, on shipping coming in and out of there and everything. We're going to treat you like a foreign country. And then they caved. Said, okay, well, we don't want that. We can't be totally independent. So they eventually ratified the Constitution as well. But in the meantime, as they had set it up, only 9 states had to pass the Constitution for it to become the law of the land. So, the United States had elections under this new structure while these 2 states were sitting out of it. George Washington easily won the presidency. John Adams was his vice president. And, knowing the anti-federalists are never going to be satisfied, James Madison fulfilled his promise of putting amendments into the Constitution. He knew that they would, if they didn't, they would forever be dogged by these accusations of tyranny. And people might be grumbling about problems with politics today, but the moment the federal government is seen stepping out of bounds, without these protections, that could instantly lead to a war. So he proposed 10 amendments. These are the amendments, that we know today. Let's go through them. That they are not part of the original Constitution, but, they were added after it. Each amendment is considered to be part of the Constitution. Like once it's in there, it is part of the Constitution. Oh, forgot I had a slide for this, talking about the favor of being Bill of Rights, favor of being out of it. Like I said, the Federalists and like Alexander Hamilton figured Bill of Rights was redundant. We figured people of goodwill are going to be in the government working for the best, working for the people, so they don't need to have these extra rights. And Alexander Hamilton even made the case that if we start listing all of the things that the people have rights of, then anything we don't list is going to be considered to be not a right. If we leave something out, then that that right could be trampled later. So he's making this case that people have more rights if we don't start enumerating and listing their rights. And this would have been where the group work is. Amendment number 1, Article 1, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of all grievances. This is a lot, and a kind of short sentence. There is a lot packed into there. So, right up the top, there can be no official state religion. And in the Constitution, it says in there that they cannot hold a religious test for office. They wanted to make sure that nobody, no place said, you have to be, this certain kind of Protestant, you have to be a Methodist to be able to hold this office in this state, and saying, no, we can't do anything like that. And it's really, with this amendment here, that's putting that out to all walks of life. This is why it's unconstitutional to have a Muslim ban. They say, Muslim people in this country can't do this thing, can't do that thing. They can't come into the country with the same freedom. That's, this is where it's going against the Constitution. Freedom of speech and press. We've seen the importance of that, going back to the Crown versus Zigner case. That's something that had been, this is 60 years later that they had accepted as an important piece of their history. And really the idea, like, what's the point of having a government, especially, a republic, if you can't, if the government can just squash the opposition's message. The people in power can keep themselves always in power if they just have this, only state media is accepted. So you cannot have a democracy in a republic without having freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And this is just saying in this that the government can't suppress the right for speech. These days, a lot of people sort of misinterpret the First Amendment to mean that they can say whatever they want, whenever they want, and nobody can get mad about it. And that's not true. You know, you're allowed to say whatever you want, and people can disagree with you, just as loudly. And also private institutions. If a university or school invites somebody to speak, and they decide they don't like what that person is saying, they can disinvite them to speak. This happened at Berkeley with that douche Milo Yiannopoulos. You know, he was invited there to speak. And you know, he said a bunch of horrible things. Berkeley disinvited him, and a bunch of people got really mad, saying like, oh, you're taking away his First Amendment right. But no, the university is a private institution that can invite whoever they want, whoever they don't want to invite. So yeah, sometimes that idea gets a little misinterpreted. Also, the freedom of assembly, which is important. You have the right to associate with whoever you want, whether this is going to be at a protest movement, or this is whatever political party you're part of, or if you're going to a Star Trek convention, you're allowed to, you know, meet with whoever you want. The right to petition government is also in here. This is, you know, we think of a literal petition that you pass around, something that people sign their names to in support of something. But this is also granting access to your elected officials. You can talk to your representative, your senator. You have to be able to, they have to be open for regular people that have some channel for them to be reached. This also opens the door for lobbying. A corporation can hire a lobbyist, to go talk to those politicians too. This is why corporations have such outsized speech in our culture, because in politics, because they pay professionals that just hang around Washington D.C. and charm and find ways without directly giving money to politicians, but with trying to be like, we're trying to coax you into getting your vote, voting for laws that we like. We saw one of the things that would go into why they would consider this at the time. We saw British officials trying to suppress freedom of speech in Boston, with all the Intolerable Acts and the occupation in Boston. That was also trying to restrict the right to protest, to deny access to government, things like that. So there's a lot of things in each of these. There's something that had happened in their history, in the lifetimes of all of these framers writing the Constitution and writing these amendments. There are things that they're recalling back to when they pass all these things. Yeah, there's been a number of laws, in the last 2 years, especially in the early years of the Trump administration, of just outlawing the right to protest. Luckily, all that stuff ended up getting shot down. So Article 2, this is one that comes up a lot. This one, nobody talked about this one until about 30 years ago. It really became a much bigger issue that's more hotly debated. But a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of the free state and the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And the reason they would pass this goes all the way back to Bacon's Rebellion. We've seen how armed citizens could literally change the government. That was considered to be, something that a necessary thing to have happened. For most people look back at that. Not necessarily saying, everything that Bacon's rebels did was right, but thinking that, that it's something that needed to be able to happen. And, obviously the revolution itself, we saw, before Lexington and Concord, the idea of keeping those munitions caches and stuff like that, and the British officials trying to take those away. And we saw the same thing happen in Shays' Rebellion just a few years prior to this. It's very in the recent memory. And they see, the idea of not being able to fight back against your government, that keeps things from being able to get done. If the government has all of the power in that way. And the Anti-Federalists were sympathetic to the rebels, feeling that afraid that any government could basically become tyrannical if left unchecked. Obviously, the founders did not envision rifles that could fire 100 rounds in a minute or whatever. So it's hard to interpret things today. Like I said, nobody interpreted this is every individual has the right to have every single gun that possible. That was not at all considered really until the 1980s that became more of an issue. And sort of in the 1960s, actually the first people that were passing gun control laws were Republicans, or conservative Republicans, because Black Panthers were carrying loaded weapons in the street. Places where there were open carry laws, they were walking those around. So the Republican Party, led by Ronald Reagan in California, passed a bunch of laws banning people's right to be able to carry weapons. Once the Black Power movement died down, things sort of switched, in that sense. And today, the idea of the right to bear arms and shall not be infringed is sort of the conservative cry around this, where more liberals would say, like, well, what about the well-regulated militia part of this? This is the idea of not just owning weapons, but you are part of this organized, trained militia. Anyway, I'm not as far as into that debate I'm going to go for sure. Article 3, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without consent of the owner, nor any time, but in the manner of the prescribed by law. Well, this is obvious why they would have thought this one. The whole Quartering Act in Boston, the idea of people being forced to have soldiers in their house, that's what they were thinking of. This one does not come up. As far as I know, has never been questioned. But there's been no lawsuit saying, the government's trying to stick a soldier in my house, in my guest bed. So yeah. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, with no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Okay, so read more clearly than I did just now. This is obviously, the idea of having warrants. You have to have a warrant, and you have to say exactly what it is you're searching for. You can't, the police can't just bust down your door looking for anything. They have to get a warrant to go into your house and look for a specific thing that they think is you being used in a specific crime. Obviously, this goes back to the idea of, the Liberty Affair, John Hancock's ship. And British officials were acting without warrants, or if they had a warrant, it was like those writs of assistance were just like blank check warrants that allowed them to check anything that they wanted. So they're definitely putting check on that. This is definitely still an important part of American life today. The War on Terror is put up a lot of questions of this in the last 20 years about what law enforcement is able to search for, our phone calls in general, like a big question. But yeah, it's, what's on cell phone records and things like that. So this is definitely still something that's we're struggling with today, and what each individual citizen's rights are. This is a long one. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless a presentment or indictment by a grand jury, except in the cases of rising. You know what? You guys can read these. There's no point in me reading this out loud, all stunted and awkwardly. But in this law, this is all about getting a free and fair trial. And you can't. The idea of a grand jury, if it's a more serious crime, they look at the evidence and decided if charges can be brought against somebody before arrest can even be made. Capital crimes are crimes that are punishable by death. The idea of double jeopardy is in here too, where you can't be tried for the same crime twice, even if if like the man who famously lynched a young boy in the 1950s, Emmett Till, in the South, when the all-white jury acquitted them of it, and everybody knew they were guilty, they went around bragging to everybody, and basically in interviews said that they had done it, but because of double jeopardy, they weren't able to be tried again for that same crime. The idea of pleading the fifth is also in here. You can't discriminate, or you can't you can't be forced to say something that would incriminate you in a crime. So when you hear in like law shows the idea of somebody pleading the fifth, saying I'm not going to incriminate myself on the stand, this is what that's referring to. Also tucked away in there too, this idea that the government can't take your stuff without any sort of trial, unless they pay you in some sense. And this is still sort of sticky today. The idea of people's cars and things like that have been seized, without pretty shaky evidence of them committing any sort of crime, and it might be a minor crime and still their car gets seized or something like that. But also the idea of eminent domain is in there. Taking your land. If the government needs your land, there are cases where like they take it, they're forcibly taking it, but they have to pay you to be able to take it. Article 6, this is more about being able to get a free and fair trial by speedy means. They can't hold you in prison indefinitely without charging you. This is something I've been thinking of a lot in terms of the people that are in jail awaiting trial during the coronavirus, and we're not having jury trials. I was supposed to have jury duty last week. Obviously, I'm gonna go to a courthouse right now, and then I got released from my jury duty. But I wholly sympathize for people who are sitting in jail waiting to get their trial. The Constitution says you have to have a speedy and public trial. Public also being key, no secret trials. The jury must be impartial, which is sort of difficult in high-profile cases. If it's very famous murder, if it's the Unabomber or something like that, it's hard to find somebody who had never heard of the Unabomber. And if somebody is that ignorant of the world or that hadn't heard of this high-profile case, do you really want them on a jury? But back then, it was easier, the idea of people not being able to find somebody who had not heard of any sort of crime. We did not have 24-hour news channels. You have the right to confront your witness in this. If you don't know who the witness is, and the witness is just saying, I saw this person kill another person. If the person being accused is like I know that witness could have been there. I have evidence they were somewhere else. It gives the defense team sort of the capability of who is this witness? So you have the right to be able to confront your witness. Of course, you have the right to attorney is also incredibly important. Most of us are not legal experts. So if we don't, we don't understand the law is incredibly complicated. So you have the right to an expert who's going to, who understands the law. Ideas also witnesses who refuse to appear in court can be held in contempt of court. If person X is, witnesses somebody committing a murder, but knows somebody else is being accused of that crime, but won't do it because they don't. It's getting complicated. I don't think it is, but you say person X was supposed to be have murdered somebody, but you think that person is an asshole, and you don't really feel like getting them off, being like, yeah, I'd rather them go to jail, so I'm not going to go to court to be a witness. They can hold you in contempt of court. Law in Article 7, this is basically just the thing saying the difference between small claims court and bigger civil cases. If you're suing somebody, there's different courts set up for what you're going to go to. Something like Judge Judy, like that shows like that's a small claims court. These things that, there's nothing, if it's like $500 or something like that, there's no reason to go, get a full jury trial to decide that. You have a judge that can decide those smaller cases. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Much of this is open to interpretation. You have the right to bail, but sometimes it's sort of unfair. The judge can set bail or whatever they want, where we are starting to see more and more the idea of, rich people accuse the crimes don't ever spend any time in jail, but if you're too poor to be able to afford that, whether you're innocent or not, that's total inequity. So we're seeing a different way of looking at what bail is. You can't have cruel and unusual punishment, so no torture. But of course, there's sort of evolving standards of decency on that. Putting somebody in stocks, like you're here, like here for being accused of libel, that would be considered cruel and unusual punishment, kind of thing. Today, solitary. The more we learn about solitary confinement, people are considering this to be a cruel and unusual punishment. If you're in solitary confinement, you're by yourself in a cell for years at a time, that drives people insane. So there's more laws being passed that's considered to be cruel and unusual punishment, and that's a violation of the Eighth Amendment. Number 9 is kind of complicated. The enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So this is the catch-all, like, Hamilton's argument of saying if we're listing all of the rights, then what about everything that we don't actually list? This is covering that. Basically saying that, even though, the Constitution might not directly say something, you still have the rights to do it. Basically, if we're not saying it, that doesn't mean we have the right to take away your rights. That makes sense. Complicated legal thing, but yeah, you can sort of see here. You're not allowed to fly the plane. Yes, the Constitution says that, even though it doesn't directly say that. So, finally, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This was sort of the states' rights argument. They didn't want to give up all of their power to the federal government. Well, this says that if we have not specifically mentioned something in the Constitution, that means it's up to the states to be able to decide it. This is still giving most of the power to the states. Like, we want this big stuff to be covered under, the federal government, but everything else the states can decide. This is a huge thing with legalizing marijuana. There's nothing, about drugs or, specifically about marijuana or anything like that, or, any sort of controlled substance in the Constitution. So, it's up to the states to pass those rights. There are federal drug laws, and then there is confusion, stuff like that. Weed is legal in California, but officially, federally, it's still illegal. Like the DEA could come in and shut down the local cannabis clubs, but they're not. But this is still the idea of the states are kind of considered to be the laboratories for democracy. The states need to be able to try new things. Each state is still individual and needs to be able to have that power. Okay. Before we go on to that, so I don't know. It's pretty easy for us these days to be sort of cavalier about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, because we all have lived in a society where this is old news. We've taken it for granted that we have all of these rights. Today we're especially cynical, after, in the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement exposed all this sort of injustice. The Vietnam War exposed, the government was committing, costing people thousands, committing all kinds of crimes in East Asia, and sending men to die even when they knew they couldn't win this war. The Richard Nixon and Watergate exposed, the corruption at the highest parts of the government. So like after that has made Americans in general very cynical about their government. Like there's no honest people up there who actually want to make lives better. But, there are, the structure is there these days, especially, a lot of us are very unhappy with who's in charge of our federal government. So we focus on the flaws, and all the times that we've fallen short of our stated ideals. But that's, completely ignoring the fact that we had all of those ideals in the first place, that they have gotten us this far through history. We're allowed to say things in public. We're allowed to question our government. I can talk shit on Donald Trump all I want. And if not for the First Amendment, somebody like him would easily have, he talks all the time about he wants to arrest the press. He says that the press is the enemy of the people. If not for the First Amendment, he would have arrested all kinds of reporters this time, and there'd be no dissenting opinions. These protections are still, very important to this day. And sometimes I think, I think of us as being like, we're like a 16-year-old kid who gets like a fancy new BMW like on his 16th birthday. And all the other kids are having the right bikes, or maybe they have crappy cars and things like that. And he's very stoked on it for a week, but then he starts complaining about it. Like, oh, well, it only goes 150 miles an hour. Sometimes if I get a flat tire and it has to get fixed, and then he's totally, spoiled by this kind of thing. I feel like we are like that. We're like, we only look at the limitations of what our government can do, or that sometimes we have to have maintenance on our government. And, we were given this great gift and don't appreciate it. I think in general, people always talk about the founders rolling over in their graves at the state of America. I think they would be very happy to see, a classroom like ours with, diverse people of all backgrounds and, coming from different countries, with different incomes, different life stories, all being in a place to improve themselves together. You guys, enroll in school, like when I enrolled in school, I didn't like my situation for what it was. I didn't like, my lack of job opportunities. So, I went to school, got an education so I can get a better job. That is an amazing thing for us to be able to do. We take it for granted because we've always lived in this world. And we say, oh yeah, other countries can do that. The United States was the first to establish all this. All other countries have basically copied the United States. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights, that is, part of every other free country in the world. We forget the United States is the oldest democracy on the planet. The longest continuous democracy that has existed, and that's, I don't know, an awesome thing. Martin Luther King has said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I heard Bernie Sanders use that quote recently. I often think, that force towards justice, that that is the Constitution, that is pushing us, that is what's bending it. So it keeps us on the right track. So this is, I don't know, appreciate, be grateful for what you have. So like I said, George Washington became the first president, and really had to set a lot of precedents. I'm going to play a video here. The link that I originally had on this video, copyrights have gone down on that, so I can't play the video, but I found another one today that's pretty good. Oops, it's a little on the dry side, but it's short and it has a lot of good information in it. So let me share this here.
On April 30th, 1789, at Federal Hall in New York City, George Washington was sworn into office as the first president of the United States and the only president in history to have been elected unanimously. To his contemporaries, Washington was the natural choice to serve as our nation's first president. By the mid-1770s, he had, in effect, become a symbol of independence and the emerging new nation. He gained international fame through his unswerving determination as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and by serving as president of the Constitutional Convention, which established a new instrument of government for the United States. He took leadership of a young nation, experimenting with a new and untried form of government. To many, success or failure of this experiment depended on the first president. Aware of the expectations of his countrymen and the world, Washington carefully guided the United States through the early turbulent years of nationhood. Over the course of his presidency, Washington worked to establish his vision of a politically strong, economically independent nation that was respected in the eyes of the world. His guiding charter was the Constitution, and he worked to establish the efficacy and authority of the document throughout his administration. Washington invoked constitutional precedent in three major instances: the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793, the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, and the Jay Treaty in 1794. In addition to international and internal threats to the nation's stability, he was tasked with lowering national debt, establishing a viable banking system, appointing the Supreme Court, establishing treaties with Indians that would open the West for American expansion, and a myriad of other challenges. Shortly after assuming office, Washington wrote to historian Catherine Macaulay Graham that he walked on untrod ground. He was acutely aware that his actions and decisions as the nation's first president would set precedent for those who followed. Consider the challenges he faced. The United States had just fought a long war to escape the tyranny of monarchy. Washington had to ensure that every aspect of the president's policies and lifestyle conformed to the ideals of Republican government. Strange as it may seem to modern Americans, matters of presidential etiquette created much controversy in the new government. The explosive power of arguments concerning Washington's social life grew out of the fact that there was nothing concrete nor established that the American people could visualize when thinking of their nation, except for George Washington, and through him, the office of president. No detail was too mundane when considering how the president would appear in the eyes of Americans and the world. Washington's first presidential term focused largely on organizing the executive branch of the new government and establishing administrative procedures that made it possible for the government to operate with the energy and efficiency he believed were essential to the future of the new republic. With the failures of the Articles of Confederation fresh in his mind, Washington believed that the federal government, as the embodiment of all of the people and states in union, should be supreme. In order to maintain and reinforce this distinction, he was careful not to subordinate himself to state officials. Many historians agree that Washington's brilliance lay in his ability to listen to opinions, often very diverse, and set a course of action. One of his most important presidential precedents was establishing a cabinet of trusted advisors. He deliberately selected experienced men who offered diverse points of view, believing they would provide the perspective he needed to make strong decisions. As his first term drew to a close, Washington became increasingly concerned over the growing partisanship within the government. Although he despised political partisanship, he could do little to slow the development of political parties. One of his primary goals as president was to develop a national character free of sectional differences. He thought it important to help unite the new nation by visiting every state. Hoping to bring the far-flung citizens of America face to face with their new federal government, he traveled to the northern states in 1789 and visited each of the southern states in 1791. The only state he did not visit was Rhode Island, which had not yet ratified the Constitution. His tours convinced him that the new government enjoyed the general support of the American people. Convinced that the government could get along without him, Washington made plans to step down at the end of his first term. His cabinet, however, convinced him that his presence was essential to ensure that the government remained on a steady course. Once again, he was unanimously elected as president. His second term was dominated by foreign affairs and by increasing partisanship within his own administration. He took office on the eve of the French Revolution and the outbreak of a general European war. He strongly believed that the United States must remain neutral in order to safeguard commerce and the nation's finances. He firmly held that the future of the nation depended on the increase in wealth and the opportunity that would come with commerce and westward expansion. While many Americans favored supporting France, Washington did not believe that the United States had the resources to win another war against Great Britain, the greatest military power in the world. Despite bitter opposition to the Neutrality Proclamation at the time, one of Washington's greatest accomplishments was keeping the United States free of war, giving the nation a chance to grow in strength while establishing the principle of neutrality that would shape American foreign policy for more than a century. By 1796, Washington was ready for retirement, and no one could persuade him to accept a third term as president. 8 years earlier, in his inaugural address, Washington had stated that he was unpracticed in the duties of civil administration, but he proved to be one of the most able administrators ever to serve as president. He exemplified fairness and integrity in his appointments and decisions, assuring Americans that the president could exercise broad executive authority without corruption, and he executed the laws with restraint, establishing precedents for broad-ranging presidential authority. Washington set a standard for presidential integrity rarely met by his successors, though he established an ideal by which they are all judged.
Okay. Let's see if I need that more. So a few things I want to hit on from that is one of the things that I like, Washington, like it says, is that he set all of these different precedents. One of those being was what to call him. In a sense, like there was a sort of like people call him His Excellency, even His Majesty, things like that. And when somebody actually asked him after he took office, like, what do we call you? And he just said, I think Mr. President would be fine. And that's what we still use today, is Mr. President. But like, it doesn't mean anything. That's a weird thing, Mr. and then like his title, like, I don't know, it's a weird sort of nonsense thing, but we still, addressing the president, it's correct, to call him Mr. President. I don't know. I think that's weird, but it's also very humble, which is, fitting with Washington's personality. It mentions this growing rise of partisanship. That's going to be a big thing over the next couple lectures here, of these political factions growing. And Washington really, really did not like that idea. He thought political factions would be the death of the country. He said, the alternate dominion of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party decision, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself despotism. But it leads to the length of more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the mind to seek the security and repose in the absolute power of the individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns his disposition and purpose over his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. It's hard enough reading things out loud in general, and trying to read 18th century language always trips me up. But anyhow, this idea that, we saw eventually, if we have these different political parties, they are going to put their own benefits and the party benefit over the good of the country. And somebody at some point is going to eventually just seize power with that in mind, thinking that, my party is so right that eventually they will ruin liberty. And it's a very prescient quote to what's going on, in Washington today. He had been this sort of living symbol of unity, and nobody doubted his commitment, over the nation's, or over, his choices. But the next people that could not necessarily be said for. This is up again. Here's the long quote here. You can read it for yourself. But he couldn't stop political parties from arising. And they didn't start up as parties at first. It starts very naturally, where you have like-minded people, some people, some politicians who agree, who are elected to Congress, and they say, help me, I'll help you, and it'd be sort of this loose network of like-minded friends. More people join that up, without any sort of official parties. They were just factions at the moment, and there's really kind of two different visions of where the country needs to go. Everybody just sort of naturally fell into these two camps. So we had the Federalists, which you already know, and when they do become a political party, they will call themselves the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists have been sort of more loosely organized, and they're going to coalesce around Thomas Jefferson, and they'll become the Democratic Republicans. This is not related to the Democrats or the Republicans today. They actually they generally call themselves the Republicans, and the Federalists called them Democrats as sort of like an insult, like you guys are too democratic. You're not really about republic. You're too about the common man. It was kind of like considered to be a dig at the time, and they just ended up putting that together. So today we call them the Democratic Republicans. So we've seen this. This is sort of the next stage after we talked about this last time. We'll talk more about it in the next lecture. More power to the federal government, more power to the states. More power for businessmen, merchants, urban laborers versus farmers, plantation owners. They have a national bank. The Federalists want this strong guiding. The bank would guide the national economy, especially they were in huge amounts of debt. So Hamilton wanted the national bank to take on that debt and be able to, make sure money, stabilized and they could just pay off the debt. But like I said, the Democratic Republicans, I mentioned this, in the last lecture, they thought, this is just going to make sure that the people in power always stay rich. It's kind of a thing. Also, we're going to see this a little bit in the next lecture too. The Federalists more favored alliances with Britain, even though they had just fought a war with Britain. It's really hard to cut, this common history and culture and language, they had shared with Britain, and the Federalists were all in favor of we should ally ourselves with them again. Whereas, especially Thomas Jefferson is going to be more in favor of aligning themselves with France, especially after the French Revolution, and say, they are also, they're a budding republic as well. They are going to, they were our oldest ally. They helped us, under the old king, they had helped us during the war. And, now they're going to be a republic. We should help them. So, these sort of rising political factions, even under Washington's administration. All these guys are part of George Washington's administration, but they have these, very strong opinions, and they're going to bring different people along with them. Jefferson in particular had this idea, which now gets called Jeffersonian democracy. His vision, where the Federalists saw industry as being the future of the country, Jefferson saw this agrarian view where the entire country would be educated, informed citizen farmers. Everybody is going to be like every person. He's one of the first people to kind of clearly talk of manifest destiny, going all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And he saw the entire United States being all of these little plots of land across the country that each person will work on, and they'll have their own financial independence because they have their own piece of land. So they do whatever they want on that land. They have their freedom by being on that land, and they grow whatever they want, whether to feed themselves or they want to sell those crops. Each person's own success is dictated by how good of a farmer they are, how much work they put into it, and of course they're going to educate themselves. They're going to make themselves good citizens, because they are, each person is individual and has their own thing. They won't be able to be swayed by rich business interests because they have their own financial independence, and they're always going to vote in their own self-interest. And this is a nice rosy vision for where the country would go. And most Americans over time would very much get on board with this. Over the next century, they're going to try very hard to make Jeffersonian democracy, a reality, but it never could have happened. For one thing, I mean, just all these separate plots of land around the country, not every piece of land is equal, that you can grow whatever on whatever plots of land. Large parts of the Midwest, you can't grow anything in a small area, but you have ranching, with these huge open areas. So just that doesn't work. The Industrial Revolution was already happening. They could not stop it. So the idea of that we would go backward in time and just not even participate in industry is kind of crazy. And plus, the idea of people being always aware and educating and voting in their own self-interests and knowing exactly what's going on. Human beings just do not work that way. Most people are ignorant of the world around them. Most people, George Carlin said, think how dumb the average person is, and realize that half of the people are dumber than him. So I'm paraphrasing the joke, but most people are not always making well-informed decisions, and most people don't even vote today. So this idea of Jeffersonian democracy was always something of a fantasy, but it was, it definitely captured the imaginations of most Americans. And a lot of people, this would be the goal throughout the 19th century to be able to achieve. Okay, that is the end of this first lecture, but now we're going to go on to another one. Let's see, we're about 40-something minutes into this. Whoops, no, close this. Open up this other lecture. This one is definitely juicier than the last one. As you can tell by the picture right here. Lots of money, sex, and shit talking in this one. So, pull up my next set of notes. As always, keep up on those learning goals. I put this slide up before, but somebody questioned me in a previous class when I said the United States is the world's oldest democracy. I said, what about Greece? But Greece, the Greeks invented democracy, but they didn't, they have not been continuously a democracy. Plus, most people couldn't actually vote there. So the United States is the oldest continuous democracy still in existence today. Okay, so this goes back to the different political parties. This is sort of a bit of a more nuanced version of that. Where am I at on here? Okay, so like I said, Hamilton, had built sort of this network. Hamilton was really, the almost inventor of political parties in lots of ways. He was the guy to kind of bring people, to him. The Democratic Republicans would basically like coalesce in opposition to the Federalists. But the Federalists, this idea of strong being pro-Constitution, pro-National Bank, and that there would to be a strong voting bloc, and the Democratic Republicans at first would be mainly trying to play catch up to that. The Federalists are pretty much going to die out after the election of 1800, and the Democratic Republicans are almost the only political party for about 20 years. So I know, I guess the Federalists die out about 1808, but yeah, they become a much weaker political party. And if you think about it, like, political parties exist for a reason. For as much as we sort of decry partisanship today, and it's horrible what we do with partisan politics today, it exists because it's two different visions for the country. Today, there is difference between conservatives and liberals. Aren't just Republicans and Democrats, simply because of geography. They do have different ideas of where the country should go. And at this time, the country is brand new. This was serious business to these guys. Like, this country is brand new, and like if we get started off on the wrong foot, we're going to set a precedent that is going to ruin this country for future generations. So they were very, very serious about these different visions. And I've already been clear about saying what those visions are, but it's not just pure tribalism as we think of it. And it is sort of ironic in a way, like that the way it worked out. Like Hamilton, this low-born bastard child from some nowhere island, he becomes the champion of the rich and the elites, and Thomas Jefferson, who was this wealthy, plantation owner, born with incredible wealth and got even wealthier. He becomes the champion of the common man and defending regular farmers. It's just sort of ironic in considering that. And also, I forgot to have said as part of the last lecture, you needed both of these factions to make the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. There could not have been one without the other. Whereas sometimes I favor the Federalist version a bit more. If they had won out and didn't get the Bill of Rights, surely we would have reverted to tyranny a long time ago. So both of these factions were necessary to build the country in what it is today. James Madison ends up switching over to join with the Democratic Republicans because even though he had written the Constitution and was essentially pro-Constitution Federalist, he feared the idea of Hamilton's vision was would crush people, and the idea of the national bank totally upset him. Where am I on here? So the French Revolution ends up being a major sort of split. Washington was all about staying neutral. He's basically saying, let Europe have its own problems. They're old Europe. We are not going to get involved in that over there. Whereas the Federalists, like I said, had said wanted to stay with Britain and largely wanted to crush the French Revolution. When the French Revolution breaks out, it's kind of crazy. It's so much, I can't go into great detail about it because that's its own class easily. There's a great podcast I have here, the Revolutions podcast. They do a good version of the American Revolution too, but the French Revolution one is really good if you want to know more about it. But, it starts out as this sort of more radical version of the of our revolution, we're going to become a republic and a democracy, and they're going to go even further. Sort of early kind of proto-communist idea of taking land away from the rich and redistributing it to the poor and things like that. And the more extreme they kind of get, they start chopping off people's heads, including their kings. And then they start chopping off each other's heads. There's counter-revolutions, and there's all kinds of problems in that. But before all of the head chopping started, the Democratic Republicans said, "Oh, we need to fight with our the French are our natural allies. Not only do they help us fight in the war, now they need our help becoming free, shaking off the old monarchy the same way we did." And the Federalists no, we need to ally with Britain. They're our cultural ancestors, and this ends up being a huge sticking point between the two going forward. And I don't want to go into too much detail on that. That will really show itself after Washington steps down. He only serves 2 terms. He didn't have to serve 2 terms. He stepped down and retired. He thought that's enough, and that set the precedent for the 2-term presidency. At the time, it wasn't law yet saying you can't go past 2 terms. He steps down. John Adams wins. He was the vice president. That election is really kind of a mess at that point. It's very much a contested election of these parties. These 2 parties were running against each other, and it almost gets it's almost a tie, and basically, it seemed like there were more people in Congress who favored John Adams, and he ends up winning the presidency at that moment. But again, I don't want to go into much detail about that right now. But the idea of what do we do with France ends up getting hugely exacerbated in what's called the XYZ affair. And this is kind of America's first war in a way, and it'll be a war with France. So this French minister, by the late 1790s, the kind of one guy that was kind of consistent with the different French governments that have been falling apart and reforming throughout the revolution was this foreign minister Talleyrand, who was just a brilliant guy and just an awesome negotiator, and would in lots of ways redraw the maps of Europe later on. Talleyrand was just a great survivor, but he's also incredibly corrupt. He doesn't do anything without getting a big fat bribe. And so, when Americans had wanted to talk to Talleyrand, like our foreign diplomats, they went to Talleyrand to talk to him about the foreign policy with America. He said, well, you have to, pay up, a little scratch. I want my big fat bribe before we even talk. John Adams, when he found out about this, was furious about this. Being like, we are allies. We've been allies with you for 20 years. We want to continue to be allies with you, and you won't even talk to us unless we give you a bribe. And Adams's people would leak this letter to the country, explaining it, saying that you need to pay a bribe. And Talleyrand's name wasn't on it. It was three of Talleyrand's underlings, and in this letter they just changed. They didn't want to give their names, so they're listed as X, Y, and Z. Like those were three people, but that's why it becomes known as the XYZ affair. And once the American public heard about this letter, they were furious about this. Like it was considered to be this slap in the face to America, from this country that had been this ally with us. And I'm not going to, again, go like so much stuff I have to sort of cut out here, but we would kind of fight a war. It was basically a few naval battles against the French over this issue. And since, the American Revolution was kind of a civil war that became a war for independence, so that really wasn't a war. This was the first time Americans were fighting another country. It's considered to be America, the first time going to war as a country. But it was a very small war at that, because it was just a few American and French ships fighting each other in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But what happens during that war is important. When things get incredibly stressed during wartime, there's this fear of foreign spies. It makes country tend to be a little more xenophobic in general, and these Alien and Sedition Acts get passed during the war. And it's sort of shocking that this stuff gets passed just a few years after, like, the Bill of Rights, because it just really smacks that stuff in the face. So the Alien Act allows for the deportation of any person in the U.S. that's deemed to be dangerous. Basically, they can deport anybody that, for any reason. So that's, just kind of crazy. The Naturalization Act in here makes it longer to become a citizen. You could become a citizen after living here for 5 years. At that point, they extend that to 14 years. They want to make it harder before anybody gets the rights of citizenship. But the worst of all is the Sedition Act in there, which makes it a crime to print any false or scandalous or malicious information about the government. And this is used to prosecute and punish publishers, newspaper editors, anybody who says bad things about government officials, about John Adams, and about the people in his Federalist administration. And to be fair, the country was still brand new, and that the attacks on public officials, so much bad press was going around that it was really undermining people's faith in the government. And from John Adams' perspective, if the country falls apart again, like it already fell apart in the Articles of Confederation and they had to rebuild, if that happens again, like this new country can't handle the stress of that. A lot of people are just going to ditch out, and this whole American experiment is going to die in its infancy. So they thought, we need to stop undermining the public's faith in public officials by keeping people from saying bad things about public officials. Should note similar laws were passed during World War I and during World War II. It doesn't make them any less un-American, because they absolutely are. And in later days, the guys who voted for this act would all sort of like, what were we thinking when we passed that? And all sort of express regret for that. But Thomas Jefferson would use this as running against John Adams. He called the Adams administration a reign of witches, comparing them to the Salem witch trials. This is the first time in American history we witch hunt and witch trial and that kind of stuff is used. That will be a reoccurring thing. The guy in office now really loves to say witch hunt a lot. Jefferson, said that the experiment of the experiment on the American mind to see how far it will. The avowed violation of the Constitution. How far can we push the Constitution? I really need to stop reading quotes because I just really can't do it today. And there was not very many people punished under this law. Only 10 people were punished. I did read somewhere that John Adams once had a guy arrested, though, at an event because he yelled out, "John Adams has a big butt." And Adams said, have that guy arrested. So yeah, I don't know. Adams was always extremely touchy about what people said about him. Like, he was way too sensitive about, what people said about him. So I can kind of believe that. And he did have a big butt. His nickname was the Rotundity. He was a big guy. This is, early in American history here. We have already sort of going against it, but this stuff will end up getting repealed later. There is one important person who's prosecuted under this act that we need to talk about, who's going to be a character that's with us over the next 2 lectures, and who's a interesting dude, if not a good one, for sure. It's a guy named James Callender, who was a journalist from Scotland, who was run out of Britain for saying horrible things about officials there. He wrote about a member of parliament, a guy named Samuel Johnson. He wrote an article called The Deformities of Samuel Johnson, and apparently just went way too far in the stuff that he had said. He talked about the massive legislative putrefaction there, and they said, well, we're still a monarchy. You can't say that shit here. So he said, fine, I'm going to America and I'm going to start brand new. And, where they have the First Amendment, I can say whatever I want. So he comes to the US and starts writing and gets a job as a stenographer in Congress. All the newspapers hired people to sit in Congress and write down what was happening and have that published in the paper later on. And the thing about this, it was not, the idea of journalistic integrity was not a thing. The press was even more partisan than it is today, way worse than Fox News and MSNBC. You had these extremely partisan newspapers. So he'd be writing down what's happening, but doing it from a very partisan angle. And he was he supported the Democratic Republicans and worked for a Democratic Republican paper. And partisanship was so bad that like fistfights would break out in the streets of Philadelphia. There would be like these rival newspapers would a story they were across the street from each other, and guys that worked for each of them got into a fight in the street one day, and apparently it was like clearing the benches. The both buildings just came out and had this huge brawl of editors and journalists just going at it. Tension ran hot. People took politics really seriously. But anyhow, Callender was this sort of brilliant writer. He could also say things that the that Jefferson couldn't say. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams generally had to be sort of above the fray. They weren't allowed to, um, go out and talk shit themselves, kind of thing. So they hired guys like Callender to be able to do that stuff for him. So Callender is, it should be known, he's famously a drunkard. Just in his personality, he's a brilliant writer, but he's apparently just constantly drunk. He's known to stagger everywhere he goes. He's completely filthy. More than once, they had to throw him out of Congress, throw him out of the building because he smelled so bad and he's full of lice. Just the smell was distracting to politicians trying to get their work done. He had like long nappy hair. He was kind of hunched over all of the time. He always kept his head tilted to one side. There's something wrong with him. With that, he's always scratching himself because he had vermin all over his body, things like that. John D. Lawrence had said, he's a Scotsman of nothing good is known. His wife had died of yellow fever early after arriving here, and he basically abandoned his 4 children while he went to work. And he was known to tell people, anybody who would listen, that he was looking for, and there's a quote, he's looking for to bring home a new wife of plump Virginia stock who could make good hominy and have the good sense to keep her mouth shut. So yeah, that's James Callender for you. Jefferson didn't like Callender at all, but he recognizes this guy is good at talking trash. And even would trash on Washington. Everybody loved Washington, and Callender would even write bad things about him. Jefferson liked being able to have someone like that on his side. Is there anything else I need to say in this? Okay. Callender would really make a name for himself. He would get famous writing about Alexander Hamilton's sex scandal. Hamilton was, back in 1792, he had, hold on one second, I got to text my wife. I also know when I'm getting done here. Back in 1792, Hamilton had met this beautiful 23-year-old woman named Maria Reynolds, who said her husband had abandoned her and she needed to borrow some money. Hamilton lent it to her, and he wrote, "It required a harder heart than mine to refuse a beauty in distress," is what he said. When he took the money to her house, apparently she had suggested repaying him in some way other than with money. He wrote that some conversation ensued from which it was quickly apparent that other than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how well you can hear my porno music cue there. So she went on repaying Hamilton for this loan in this way for a while. Then it turned out Mrs. Reynolds' husband had found out about the affair that was going on and blackmailed Hamilton, demanding repeated payments, or he would tell the newspaper, that Hamilton was cheating on his wife with Reynolds' wife. Hamilton paid up and then continued to keep having sex with Mrs. Reynolds. And leading, many people to sort of point out that, James and Maria Reynolds probably had planned this whole thing from the start. The husband was pretty much acting as his wife's pimp. They draw Hamilton into this situation, have sex with this beautiful woman, say, if anybody, you better pay up or we're going to tell everybody about it, but go ahead and keep doing it, as long as you keep paying. So it's a pretty sordid affair for sure. James Reynolds was eventually arrested for other reasons. Apparently he was scamming, he was ripping off the pensions of Revolutionary War veterans. So yeah, not a great guy on many levels. And then in hopes of commuting a sentence for the, this crime, he starts talking, he starts blabbing to people like, hey, like, I have dirt on Hamilton. Like, if you give me less of a crime, or I'm going to start telling people all about Hamilton. That's how James Monroe found out about what happened. And even though Monroe politically opposed Hamilton, he said, we got to keep this secret because we all have dirty laundry, and we don't want our dirty laundry getting flushed out. If that gets, this type of stuff starts, getting out there, the public is never going to have faith in our and their private leaders, their public leaders. Someone's hammering outside my window. Okay, well, we're almost done. So, basically said, it's a private matter. It doesn't need to be made public. And the information all stayed secret for a number of years. That was in 1792. In 1796, James Callender, the journalist, got his hands on this. And of course, Callender wrote about all of it, telling everybody and accusing, of Maria Riddles of being a prostitute, James Reynolds as being a pimp, saying Hamilton was worse than an ordinary John. And, Callender wrote also that, Hamilton must have done worse than just the adultery. Like, if he's been paying up all of this money for this, he's probably also been doing corrupt things as Secretary of Treasury as well. And the Reynolds had found out about that also. So Callender quickly blows up this whole thing, saying if he had an affair and paid for it, then he must be a corrupt politician as well. And Hamilton, had to confess. He said, yes, it's true. I cheated on my wife. Yes, I paid to keep that whole thing quiet. But the corruption charge is completely baseless. And it was, as far as we know. We have no reason to think that Hamilton was corrupt in his role of government at all. But to prove that, to say like, no, I swear I didn't have corruption. This is just a sex scandal. He said, go talk to James Monroe. He found out about this whole thing. And, he knows about all the evidence against me, and he decided to keep it quiet. He knew that this is nothing but a side piece. So, we kept it quiet. And we made this decision together in a smoky back room. So don't worry, you guys don't need to know about it. This didn't help. Most of the public was like, what the fuck? You guys are like having secret backroom deals about like, who's corrupting government, and you're covering up like sex scandals and secrets. Like, what else is going on about that? And Monroe's pissed because Monroe's like, why are you bringing my name into this? I did you a solid by keeping all this quiet, and now you are dragging me into this, making me look bad. So Monroe was not very happy about that. And actually, their argument led to them say our honor cannot be restored until we have a duel. And Hamilton and Monroe had plans to go, face off and, duel each other. And the guy who talked them out of pistols at dawn, basically, none other than Aaron Burr, the guy who would later on, if you've seen the Hamilton musical, the guy who would murder Hamilton in a duel a few years later, is a guy that talked them out of, Monroe and Hamilton getting into this duel. So there's all kinds of, I love this dirt. So you could argue that this is not a sex scandal. It's not like important to American history sort of thing. But I think, I don't know, it's important to see the founders are having sort of, they were real people who had, problems that people today have. Obviously the current president had a lot of extramarital affairs. Bill Clinton, had extramarital affairs. We've seen all kinds of stuff come of this. And this really did ruin Hamilton's reputation when the public found out about it. He still served in government, but at no elected position. Hamilton actually was never elected to things. He was not a particularly likable guy, it seems in most cases. But he was thought of as somebody who could potentially run for president one day. It's often thought that he didn't run for president because he was born out of the country, which is not really quite right, because everybody who was in the country when the U.S. automatically became citizens. So he could have done it. It's really because he never could have gotten the votes for it after the sex scandal happened to him. So, this happens in 1796. Like, we're not done with James Callender. He's going to come back briefly. and importantly, well, and actually, so he's becomes Jefferson's main attack dog, more or less. Jefferson officially does not approve the type of things Callender says, but is paying him money on the side. And the Federalists really go after Callender after this. They're try to tear him down for taking down their party leader. Hamilton has been humiliated. Callender liked to claim that there are assassins that were coming after him. He just narrowly escaped twice, but everybody knew he was full of shit. Nobody really believed the stuff that he said. And he's reduced to begging for food in Virginia for a while. He got arrested for vagrancy and drunkenness several times. But that's, going to the election of 1800, Jefferson's like, I want to be sure this guy's on my team, and paid him to be like I said, be his attack dog. And some of the famous stuff that he said, Callender wrote about John Adams, that Adams was a hideous and hermaphroditical character, which neither the force nor firmness of a man, nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Which is, for whatever else we hear in American politics today, nobody's calling anybody else a hermaphrodite. That's, I don't know, maybe we should. Also, take your choice between Adams, war and beggary, or Jefferson and peace and competency. Adams' side also had stuff. They were also talking trash too. One of their writers said Jefferson was a mean-spirited, low-lived son of a half-breed Indian squaw sired by a Virginia mulatto father. At the time, calling somebody's whiteness into question was considered to be, that's huge. They also said that, Jefferson was an atheist who would see our wives and daughters the victims of legal prostitution. That's pretty heavy out there. At one point, Adams's men, going to the election of 1800, just before the election, they started a rumor that Jefferson was dead. So, why don't bother coming out to vote for him because he's dead. But obviously, that didn't make that much of a difference there. But all of the stuff that Callender had wrote about Adams ended up getting him arrested under the Sedition Act. He was one of the last people prosecuted for it. He was sentenced to 9 months in jail, had to pay a $200 fine, which is a lot of money back then, and asserting that Callender's attacks on Adams, was an attack upon the people themselves. And it's absolutely, no matter how horrible Callender is, it's absolutely shameful that somebody was prosecuted, for just calling someone else a hermaphrodite, basically. So we're going to leave Callender for now in jail. He will come up in the next lecture, importantly. In that election of 1800, the very bitter election, it seemed, usually is worse than even the 2016 election as far as trash going between these two parties. But Jefferson wins, and this was has its own sort of problems in this. Well, you know what? I'm going to leave it there. This has already been running long on time, and I think this lecture will fit in because the next lecture is all about the Jefferson presidency. So yeah, I'm going to leave it here, and on next Tuesday, I'll pick up this and we'll talk about the Jefferson presidency. We'll talk about Adams getting assassinated, Aaron Burr tries to make himself Emperor of Mexico, and some other stuff happens too. So that is it for today. I don't think there's anything else to tell you guys. I will see you next week.